All right, welcome everyone to Chapter 1 of our class, looking from the book E-Commerce. So for today, what I want to do is cover the basics of what is the internet. Now, this might sound like a really fundamental or really super easy thing to get, you know. You're on the internet probably every day, many times, multiple times a day. I know I am. But what I have found throughout the years of teaching this class is, even from IS students, and much more from the populace at large, there are some fundamental misunderstandings of what exactly is the internet. So I want to make it extremely clear up front what exactly it is. So when you're talking to other people, or you're going out on job interviews, or you're helping people to have questions, or have issues with their computers and connecting to the internet, you can speak with authority as to what exactly is the internet and how is it different than everything else that might be out there. Now, to get to that point, I want to do a brief history of the internet, and I'm really only going to cover from, well, it's kind of the foundations back in the 1960s until 2000 basically. And then what we're going to do after today is look at everything in the last 12 years and 13 years, is that last bit from 2000 on. We're also going to look at what is the fundamentals of business, because we want to really get to how can we create or how can we use the internet to really help business be successful. That really kind of summarizes what an information systems professional can do, is not just understand the technology, but you also have to understand the purpose of business and how this technology can help the business. So with that being said, let's start. What exactly is the internet? Now, some common answers to that question might be something to the effect, well, that's the World Wide Web. That's these web pages we go to every day. And that's part of the answer, but it's not completely the answer. Some people might say it's a really big network, okay? It's all these computers connected together. And that's getting a little bit closer to the truth, but it still doesn't quite capture what it is. All right? So let's be clear what the World Wide Web is. It is not just the World Wide Web, www, those little initials you see in front of websites. Because guess what? Email doesn't need the World Wide Web, but email goes on the internet. We'll also start using a technology called FTP, which stands for File Transfer Protocol. FTP is part of the internet, but is not the World Wide Web. And so, while today a lot of people speak of those two as synonymous, they are not. The World Wide Web is part of the internet. It is not the entirety of the internet. Okay? It is also not just a protocol. And we'll talk about the primary protocol of the internet, and particularly get into a lot of details in that in Chapter 2. Although it's necessary and needs one and uses one, that is not what the internet is. And let's also be clear that there is only one internet, okay, with a capital I. It only exists because there are other networks. In other words, an internet essentially is by definition, is a connection between networks. Kind of like the interstate system. Okay, an interstate is basically something that connects two states. It's a road that connects two states, right? So the interstate system connects all these states together with our roads. The internet connects the networks together through a protocol, a series of protocols that allows you to connect to these. All right, so what exactly is the internet? What some people like to describe it as, and it's getting to the right point, and this was what makes it somewhat nebulous, but they call it a network of networks based upon the fundamental protocols of TCP/IP. So yes, the protocol is part of the definition, but is not the summation of it. And the reason why we have that is because you can still use TCP/IP, and if you don't understand what that means yet, we'll get to it. Don't worry. That's Chapter 2. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts of TCP/IP. But right now, just know the acronym and know that it is necessary to have this network of networks. But TCP/IP in and of itself, excuse me, is not the internet, because you can have TCP/IP within an individual network that doesn't connect to anything else. So how did it all begin? Well, I like to start with Sputnik, and you're probably thinking, why Sputnik? Or if you even know what Sputnik is. And hopefully you enjoy the picture at the bottom. Sputnik, it was the first satellite ever launched into space. It was launched by the Russians, not by us. They were the ones first to launch anything into space, a satellite by the name of Sputnik. Now, why is this important to what we're talking about? Well, if you can imagine what was going on at the time, this was in the 1950s. Sputnik was launched, I want to say 1957. Please correct me if I'm wrong with that. Sputnik was launched by the Russians during the very beginning of the Cold War. Now, why is that significant? Well, because we knew the Russians also had atomic bombs. Now, this freaked out a lot of people because we were already worried that the Russians were going to try to nuke us. And now they had the ability to launch satellites into space and presumably to have those same satellites come crashing back down onto us. And we had no way of stopping them. And we were really freaked out because we thought, us here in America, we were the most technologically advanced country in the world, and here the Russians were ahead of us in the space race. So, like anything, when people get freaked out, what do? They go to the government and say, help protect us. And so the government said, all right, our biggest problem is that we're behind on this advanced research. And so they put together something called the Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as ARPA. Founded by Eisenhower during the Sputnik era in Congress, and continually funded by every single president since. And as the name might suggest, they deal with a lot of advanced research. Now, the very first gentleman to run ARPA was a guy by the name of Licklider. And he envisioned as one of their very early projects a network of such computers connected to one another by wide-band communication lines, which provided the functions of present-day libraries connected with anticipated advances in information storage and retrieval and other symbiotic functions. Now, this quote actually comes from the early 60s, long before ARPANET actually came into existence, and we'll look at that in a second. But this was the vision, way back in the 60s, of what they wanted. Now, there were networks prior to this, very simple networks, okay? But what they wanted is something a little bit more advanced that provided wideband communication lines that could store information and transmit information across different computers, right? So with the ARPANET funding, which came out of ARPA, it finally was created in 1969. So one of the earlier projects in ARPA. The 4 nodes, the first 4 computers were at Stanford Research Institute, UCLA, UC San Bernardino, yeah, I probably screwed that up, but that's all right, and then University of Utah. Okay, 4 nodes, and it quickly started growing after that. But the original idea was they wanted to have these computers network together to help support research by many scientists at these institutions. Okay, so it started in the university system, designed to help support advanced research. It also started including very quickly military institutions with occasional, and by occasional I mean very, very few, connections to vendors and suppliers, so commercial businesses. But usually only those that had major research facilities that were doing research similar to what the universities and military was interested in. Okay. So things like Boeing, IBM, and a few other very large institutions. Now, while this was being done, you have to realize that, like I said, this was not the only network in existence. There were other competing networks out there. Like IBM had their own network that they shared basically with their mainframe customers. They started connecting them up who wanted to join the network. And so there was already several other competing networks. Now, ARPANET created with a protocol. It wasn't very successful, and they really quickly saw the limitations. In 1973, they developed TCP/IP. Okay. Now, just because you've developed a protocol doesn't mean everyone's going to use it. In fact, not many people did until 1981. And what happened in 1981? Well, again, because this is a government-run institution, the government basically said, if you want to do any contracting or any work with us through the military institutions, we require you to have TCP/IP on your computers and to transmit data that way. And that quickly set the standard, countrywide. So now pretty much every single new mainframe or even the mini computers that were being created in the 1970s had to have TCP/IP just installed on it. Almost every single computing vendor, started putting that on to meet this requirement, so that way it was not a limitation of their computers to be able to connect to a network. Now, what was really unique about TCP/IP, and a good comparison is to look at a comparison to the phone system. But TCP/IP made the host, the person delivering the message, rather than the network itself, responsible for the transmission. Okay. Now, if you think about when you pick up the phone to make a call, the telephone companies spend a fortune on their actual network itself. And the telephone companies make it their responsibility to keep the network up and running at all times that they can. Right? That is their primary objective, and that's what we pay them all this money for, is to have this network available for us to use to make phone calls. Now, in the very early days of computing, though, these networks were not very reliable, and so they weren't confident that the network would always be up. Okay, and some of these networks did run in the phone system. Some of these were separate wires created. And we also just didn't know what type of network it would be running over. So TCP/IP, by the very definition, was made so that the host, when it sends its message, includes information about the message that's being sent. So that way at the other end, the person receiving the message can gather up all the information about these packets that are being sent to them, and can reconnect and put together and make sure the entire message was received. What was great about this was it allowed multiple networks to connect together very easily, because the network itself was not that important, because the host made sure the message got there. And if it didn't, it gave you a message saying, we couldn't get there. All right. And again, we'll get more into this in chapter 2, but this is kind of the fundamental difference. What makes this different than the phone system or other networks. Okay. Now, so what was going on here? So ARPANET, you have to think about, was all about, ARPA itself, Advanced, and just look at the name, Advanced Research Project Agency, right? They're all about doing cutting-edge research. What they did not want to have to do is maintain an ongoing system. Makes sense, right? They want to do advanced stuff. And once it's created, it's no longer advanced. It's just kind of ho-hum. So ARPA didn't want to have to maintain this. So at first they handed it over to the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense said, yeah, we don't want to do this either. So they handed it over control to the National Science Foundation. Now, the National Science Foundation also had their own network. Like I said, there was a lot of other competing networks. Theirs was called the CSNet. And they combined them together with the ARPANET and created NSFnet in 1986. Now, you have to understand, at this time it's growing. We got everything putting together, all these different computers throughout the world. And they started realizing they needed backbones. Now, if you can think about the backbone in the human body, all right, what's going on inside there? Okay, you got all these nerves that are compacted together, and then from this backbone, from your spinal cord, your nerves reach out to the rest of the body. So your hands and your feet, they have these little side nerves that go off in all these different directions. And that's kind of the idea of a backbone. The internet backbone is the same concept. It consists of major wires that carry loads of information, and they stretch from major cities, major nodes. And then from there, you can imagine each one of those major nodes, so we see 6 in this picture, there is all kinds of like a hand, a fingers, digits sticking out to all these other computing systems that are close to it. Now, I'm not showing you all those little fingers, but those were in existence, but those smaller fingers had smaller wires that could carry less bandwidth. These are the big bellies. These are the ones that carry the most amount of bandwidth. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, because these backbones grew over time. All right, so we're going through the 80s. It's still growing. By 1990, ARPANET is completely shut down. There's no more ARPANET in existence. NSFnet is completely and totally in charge. They have completed their merger. The number of computer hosts exceeds 200,000. All right. And we're already starting to connect overseas. Okay, so it's not just a U.S. phenomenon anymore. But 200,000 computers. Now, if you think today, 200,000 computers, well, that's not even all the computers in the Raleigh-Durham area. Here, at the time in 1990, well, that's probably almost every single mainframe and a lot of mini computers at every single university in the U.S. Right? Network backbone has been upgraded to something called a T3 line, which carries 45 megabits per second. Now, that sounds pretty big, but when you think about what you might have in your own home, okay, so the Ethernets in our own home, those cables can carry more than 45 megabits per second. So within your own home, you have that capability. But at the time in 1990, and this is only a little over 20 years ago, this was the backbone of the internet. That's all it needed to carry. Okay. Email was probably the most popular tool at the time, okay? And there was no World Wide Web yet. There was FTP, which stands for File Transfer Protocol. There was Telnet, which is kind of an application sharing program. And there's something called Usenet, which was, a best way to describe it is kind of like a very early version of a message board. And those 4 were kind of the most common tools at the time. But in 1990, hypertext linking was created. And there was 2 cases where it was created, and we'll really focus on one of those that's most relevant to us. And there were a lot of other commercial networks in existence. Like I told you briefly about the IBM network, and there was a number of other ones. But they were all competitors, and they didn't necessarily use TCP/IP on those networks. And they did not connect together. They were all independent. So there was no connection between these networks. So if you wanted to have your computer hooked up to both networks, essentially you needed to have 2 wires coming into that same computer, one for each network. And then if you wanted to try to jump between one network and another, don't even get me started about how complex that got it. So it was not easy at the time. It was kind of a crazy world at that point. 1991, major changes happened, and we'll talk about 3 big things. Okay, first, NSFnet officially lets commercial traffic on its backbone. And by commercial traffic, I'm not just talking about some of those select vendors and suppliers I had mentioned earlier. Now we're saying if you're willing to pay NSF money, any business could connect to the backbone. Now that's huge, and you'll probably see why very shortly. But this is what really started the dot-com boom. Started in 1991. Number 2, World Wide Web was released. Okay, so hyperlink, we said, was invented back in 1990, but the entire World Wide Web protocol, HTML, which we're going to get into and spend a good portion of our class talking about, was not even created until 1981. right? Long after the internet had already been in existence. So we have the World Wide Web, and then Congress passes the Gore bill. Now, many of you probably have heard the infamous story of Al Gore when he said he created the internet, or invented the internet, whatever the terminology he used. It was very, very poorly worded. What he was referring to was the bill that he sponsored, the Gore bill, which financed lots of research, and included a lot of money for network capacity expansion of the internet. All right. And for one of his research projects, which we'll look at, was something called a Mosaic, which was the first browser, very popular browser for actually viewing the World Wide Web. So in a sense, yes, he helped create what the World Wide Web is today, because the funding, and when I say a sense, he helped get Congress to pay. Basically, by Congress, I mean us, because with our taxes, we're paying for it. But we got, our money was used to fund the research to create the browsers that allowed us to get on the World Wide Web. Total traffic exceeds over 1 trillion bytes for the year 1991. Now we're talking here, okay? Now it's in over 100 different countries. Over 600,000 hosts, and nearly 5,000 separate networks have been connected. So like I said, the internet is a network of networks, meaning it's the foundation that connects many different networks together. Okay, and at this point there are already 5,000 separate networks that now can connect. And the hosts, and usually by they mean hosts, they're talking about either a computer or a router or some point in the connections between other computers. All right, so with the funding from the Gore bill, we have a new backbone created in 1992, and you can see it's a new T3 network connecting together all these major cities. From Greensboro was the closest, and you can see from this graphic some of the fingers that led off, and they pointed to a lot of different nearby cities that were connected together. Okay. And that's essentially what it started to look like at this point. And then there was major wires that ran between these cities, the T3's connections. All right, let's move forward to 1995. Another banner year. So the Mosaic browser, the founder of that browser decided to create a company called Netscape and created a browser that he could sell in the marketplace. It became so popular that they decided to take an initial public offering and take the company public. And Netscape, in 1995, went public. Now, what was so interesting about this IPO, it was the first major internet company to have an IPO that simply exploded when it got onto the stock exchange. When gangbusters, and everyone noticed this in the business world. Everyone said, wow, dude, this internet thing is going to be huge for money making. Okay, so it only took 4 years from when traffic was allowed to when everyone started realizing, holy son of a gun, we can make some money here. All right, so within 5 years, every single major business out there and many smaller businesses had websites. And even some little mom and pop shops who put up a website but did it before everyone else did made a fortune selling things that people just were like, well, I want this little knick-knack that I didn't think I could get. It was actually a really, really incredible, crazy time. It kind of created the dot-com boom at that point. Now, NSF decided at this point that they wanted to completely divest all of the backbone. So they started selling it off to various different companies. Okay, so, and if you look today, there's actually, I would say, about 30 different companies in the U.S. that have backbone networks. It's not a single company. It's not just AT&T. It's not just Verizon. But a number of different companies, and some of them, they don't even do any phone systems. They do just internet backbone Okay, which today, a lot of it's running over, a lot of the phone systems are running over Internet Protocol. So you might as well call them phone companies now. So at any rate, 95, we see things really start being noticed, just how huge it is. In those 90s, with the explosion of websites being created, there was really inadequate ways of finding information on the web. Search engines technology was really bad. And Google was founded on a new search principle. And since we'll spend a little time talking about this principle later in the semester, I really kind of want to bring this up, at least as kind of an introduction. Because Google, their one really unique idea that gave them so much popularity as a search engine was that how we rank our websites is going to be based not only on what they put on their own website, but based upon what other people link to that website. And we'll talk about that in a lot more depth later. But that is the fundamentals of what Google did and what they did really well. Also significant years because that's when I started doing web development. So I've been at it for a few years now. Banner year there, right, in 1998. So by 2000, and this is kind of where we'll end our history lesson. What's called the internet bubble pops, and there's tons and tons and tons of bankruptcies. In fact, I was in a company that went bankrupt in 2000. It was a fun experience. So in 1999 and 2000, I worked at this small sports broadcasting company, and it had some great content and absolutely zero cash flow. So it bottomed out quick. All right. Now, when we say this, that there was a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of .com companies who simply didn't make money, a lot of people think that this meant the end of e-commerce. Well, that in fact did not happen. And if you actually look at the numbers, and there's actually a recession during 2000 and 2001. And with the internet bubble pop and everyone was talking about how horrible it is, look at the numbers of the amount of sales in e-commerce, and it actually increased throughout 2000 and 2001. What happened was not a complete destruction of the environment. What happened was people finally stopped speculating on businesses that had no business model. The ones that had good business models kept doing it and kept doing it well, and they kept growing. Companies like Amazon is probably the primary example here. They rocked it. They figured out the formula, and they did it extremely well. They kept growing and growing significantly throughout 2000 and 2001. Okay. And so when we get into the rest of this semester, that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about is what's been going on since then. Okay. We're also going to talk about kind of the second phase of e-commerce. Some people call it Web 2.0, and we'll get into more details of that later in the semester as well. But we want to focus kind of on that area. So in the past, 12 to 13 years is what we're going to spend our time focusing on, because that's really where the magic's starting to happen now, and when we can get really cool stuff. So here's the interesting thing. We look at the internet and realize that the internet was created when we only had mainframes. There were no PCs back in the 1960s, okay, or even 1970s. They were just starting to come up with what was called mini computers at the time, or small, basically servers. But they were popular even throughout the 80s and 90s when we had a lot of the PCs coming in. And now today we have the growth of smartphones and tablets and now information appliances. We have the internet connected to washers and dryers and refrigerators and whatnot. If you want, you can buy those. Why has it been so successful throughout all these transitions? Okay, so the computing systems have changed. Our network that connects them together has stayed the same. Now, granted, there's been some changes to these, such as now everyone has a PC, and some might say, well, that's why the World Wide Web was so successful, because we had these nice graphical, screens that we could use to see everything with. Be that as it may, it's still applicable to things like information appliances. Like I said, we can have a refrigerator that connects to the internet, and it can send information back and forth between the fridge and the manufacturer. Okay, it doesn't need a screen for that. It just does it behind the scenes. So here's the question: why? Why has it been so successful? Okay. Number one is that they have open standards. The internet is based upon an open standards framework, essentially meaning that no one individual controls what the standards are. They're not proprietary. They're open to change. And there's a means for sharing changes in standards over time. And that's kind of number two. Not only is there a means to do it, but the way it's developed is that the changes in standards are very quickly communicated throughout the entire network. And number three is that the network was actually built for high flexibility and high reliability. Okay, it was not, and this is very important, it was not built for speed. So if you ever go to those web pages and you click on a link and it takes, days for something to show up. Okay, not days. It takes, 10 seconds or 15 seconds for a page to show up. Just keep this in mind. The internet was not designed to be fast. What it is designed to be is very reliable and very flexible to deal with changes. And because it's been designed to deal with changes, and it's designed to be reliable getting information from one point to another, because it doesn't depend on the network itself, it depends on the host. So as long as the host can send an internet message, it can work. And as long as it's connected to those other computers, it can work. So that is why the internet has been such a success. Okay, it has open standards, so no one person controls it. They actually have some committees that help make recommendations, and those recommendations go out to all the manufacturers, and the manufacturers can choose to use them or not use them, or to collaborate with other manufacturers and come up with what they want. If you look at the browser wars, from Netscape to Internet Explorer to Google Chrome to Firefox to Opera, or to Apple Safari. Okay, there's all these different browsers out there for viewing information on the web. Well, they all have a different set of way of viewing web pages. There's no standard way across. Now, they do come up with some standards, but each manufacturer can choose to implement those standards or not. And we can talk more about that too, is how does that mixture of web standards affect or impact the way pages are viewed? In fact, and that was one of the biggest headaches as a web developer, and especially during early days, was the differences between the different browsers made it very difficult to create web pages that looked the same, regardless of the page or the type of browser that the user was using. All right, so let's move on. We talked about the internet, got the history, why it was so successful. Now, before I really show how the internet can be successful in business, I want to take a quick step back and say, all right, what is the purpose of business? Why do we have business? What's the whole point of it? And I wish more business professors would talk about this, because it's kind of a fundamental concept, and oftentimes assumed, but that assumption can kind of lead to problems later. All right, so what is the purpose of business? And you probably have some ideas when I ask that question already formulated in your mind. The purpose of business might be to create products or to create goods. The purpose of business might be to make money. The purpose of business might be to give people jobs. The purpose of business might be to satisfy people's whims. And some of those all hit on certain truths. But at least the way I like to envision is the purpose of business is to create an organization that creates things of value. It is an organization, an organized system of creating values. And I like to use that because it's nice and generic enough to cover almost every type of business out there. All right. So by an organizational system, so it's some system. It's a way that's been designed to repeatably create value. So when you create something, right, you create something that you want, that you need, that you want to be able to use. If it's not something of value, who the hell's going to buy it, right? So it's got to be something of value that people want if you're going to sell it, if you're going to make money. And it has to be systematized so that you can continually create this money. Else it's just a one-off creation, like an artist creates something. Or a carpenter might build a thing once. Well, that's not quite a business until they're continually creating things with wood, right? Or a computer manufacturer. If you just create one computer once, that's not a business. You've created something of value, absolutely. But it isn't until you start creating computers on a regular basis or creating something of value on a regular basis that it becomes what is a business, right? So what is needed for a business to stay in existence? And there you can get into several different things. But most importantly is that it needs to have a cash flow, right? Well, first off, you have to have something to sell, some item or service to sell. And you have to sell it for more than what it costs to create it. Okay, and now this is speaking in general terms. Now you can have sometimes create multiple products, and one of those you lose money on, but the rest of them make enough money to cover it. Be that as it may. Overall, you have to sell things for more than what it costs to create them. You also have to create more value for the customer than the sale price. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is people are only going to buy something if there's enough value in the price that they're willing to pay for it. Okay, so the customers have to decide, this is something that not only that I want, but I can afford. And me parting with my money to get this is worth it to me because what I get out of it is freaking awesome. Okay, so they have to want that product more than the money that they already have. And it's better than all the other alternatives. So the customer could say, well, I could buy your product, and yes, it is a value at this price, but I can get the same thing from your competitor for half the price. So I'm going to go with the competitor, right? So no, you have to be comparable to what other people are selling things. Okay, and I'd say those big three things are what are needed for a business to stay in existence. So, well, what types of things do businesses do then to help you get to that point? Well, one, you have to know who your customers are. Okay, you have to know what they need. You have to be able to design a product or service to satisfy that need. You need to purchase, your supplies and your raw materials to create your product or your service. You need to be able to manufacture, so to create that system of actually creating the product or creating that service in a repeatable format. Then you need to market and sell your product or service back to those customers you've identified. Deliver that product or service. So after you've created it, you've marketed it, you've sold it, and then you have to deliver. And lastly, you have to support. Okay? And make sure that, yes, did it really satisfy their needs? Is the product we sold defective? Let's fix it. Okay, if it is. Those types of things. So these are the very basic business activities, and you can go through most business books, intro-level business books, and they talk about these different activities that need to be done. And some might list one or two others or take one or two off, but this is essentially the main things that need to get done, right? Now, there's also a series of other things that a business needs to do to keep the business going, okay? And these are kind of the internal support services, including finance, accounting, administration, human resources, and even information technology. And these are things that help all the above activities. Okay. Now, Where does the internet fit in? Okay. Well, there's two areas. So we can add value to the customers, and we can add value to the internal support services. Right? So how can we add value to the customers? Well, one, we can communicate much faster with our customers. And a lot of you probably have a lot of experience with this. You email someone asking for questions about a product you want to buy. Right? You can reduce your transaction costs. Right? So you don't need as much overhead, especially if you're dealing in e-commerce. We'll look at a lot where it can reduce a lot of costs and how you make your sale. It brings it down significantly. So now, especially like for me, I love buying from Amazon because the transaction costs are so low. Right? And so I can buy something, have it shipped to my house cheaper than it would for me to drive to Target or Walmart to go buy it. There's also much greater time availability, especially if you have significantly reduced, you work a lot, or you're going to school and you work part-time and you hardly have time to get to the store. You get home at, midnight, and you realize, oh shoot, I'm low on, paper towels. Well, I can run to Amazon, order it, have it shipped overnight to my address, and have those paper towels the next day. Right? Super sweet and easy. Okay. You also have greater distance availability. So, it used to be that, 50 years ago, you wanted something, well, you could only get things that are local. That was it. There was no long distance, there was long distance trade, but not much long distance trade. Now there's so much more, trade that goes on across the world, and it's so easy to do it because you can easily jump on the internet, and the internet connects people together almost seamlessly across great distances. And you hardly even know that you might be dealing with a company that's in India or that's in Europe or wherever. Right? And also another wonderful thing about the internet is you can do kind of one-stop shopping. So instead of going to 5 different places to buy everything you need, and again, I love my Amazon example because Amazon.com does a phenomenal job at this. But I can buy everything I need at one place. I can even buy groceries. I can buy CDs, books, clothing. What else? I don't know where else to go. I mean, I can get that all from one stop. Okay. Or maybe you're dealing with Google, and they have a series of their own shopping cart where you can get all kinds of things all together at one place. Okay, you don't have to go to all these different stores. And then there's a concept called disintermediation. So if you think of what is an intermediary, right? An intermediary is someone who is between the manufacturer and the final seller, and we've always had these throughout time. Okay, someone who has to take something that the manufacturer is creating and sell it to the customers, because oftentimes the customers don't know about all the different manufacturers, or the manufacturer's far away. So the intermediary will bring those things to you. But what we found was that with the internet, the manufacturer can now skip this intermediary. Okay? They can now directly sell to the customer. And so there was one example of this, it really brought it home to me, was a story one of my neighbors told me about when he bought an engagement ring for his wife. And at the time, the internet was getting going. I mean, it was probably in the early 2000s when this story took place. But he went online first to do his research. He found a diamond he really liked. He thought this is the perfect diamond. But he wasn't comfortable buying online because he didn't know enough about this company. And so what he did do was he printed out the specifications of this diamond, and he took it to a nearby jeweler and said, I'm looking to buy this ring for my wife. I want a diamond that looks a lot like this one. And so the jeweler said, let me go look at the diamonds we have in back to see if we can have something that comes close to these specifications. They went back. They said, no, we don't have anything quite like this, but one of our our distributor has it, okay? So they said, why don't we have the distributor send the diamond to us, and then you can take a look at it. So the next day, they get a phone call. The diamond's in. He comes, takes a look at it, and the diamond is exactly like the one he saw in the specifications. Exact same specs, okay? I got him to wonder, well, wow, that's pretty impressive. But the price was much higher than he found online. So he's like, all right, I like the diamonds. I don't like the price. I'm going to go look at another jeweler. So he goes to the next jeweler, does the same thing. He asks him, I'm looking for this kind of diamond with these specifications. The jeweler did the same thing. He went in back, said, no, we don't have a diamond just like this, but our distributor has a diamond just like what you're looking for. Let me give them a call, and we'll send it here, and you can take a look at it. So a day later, they get a phone call saying, hey, we got the diamond in. It's exactly what you want. The guy goes to the jeweler, looks at the diamond, and then, yes, the specification for this diamond exactly matched what he found online. He started wondering, what's going on here? And then he put two and two together. These two jewelers were using the same distributor. The distributor where he had found online the specifications. And he said, wait a minute, my jewelers are using the distributor, they trust the distributor, why don't I trust the distributor? I can get the same diamond at a significantly reduced price by going directly with the distributor. And so he bought from a company called Blue Nile, BlueNile.com, which was a distributor of diamonds. And he saved himself a ton of money. That is disintermediation in action. All right. And another one is something called the network effect. Now, this is a really kind of a little bit harder concept to get, and we'll spend an entire class talking about that. But basically, it's the concept that as more and more and more people start getting and using the same network, the value goes up, not just linearly, but geometrically and even exponentially, to the point where as people start interacting on these networks, the more people that join the networks, the better the network becomes for everyone. All right, so that's how it can help your customers. Now, how can it help your internal business? All right, it's a lot of the exact same things. You got quick communication, extremely fast. Now, and yes, you could have picked up a phone and called people, but not everyone's at their desk all the time. So you send an email, which is great because people can get back to it whenever they're available, or sometimes even away from their desk, they can get back to you. You see a lot of reduced internal costs, so you can really greatly create efficiency through internal cost reductions by transferring information electronically, rather than having, if you look at some of the old, message systems, they'll have like big tubes that they would shoot messages through, or sometimes they would have to hire couriers to carry things from one building to the next. You don't need all those anymore, right? Have greater time availability and greater distance availability. So now your business can keep running 24/7 very, very easily. And in fact, we've seen this like with customer support. It used to be that customer support only lasted from 9 to 5. And now businesses are finding it easy. What they do is they hire some people in India. Sometimes they have some accent problems, yes, but they're also training these Indians to have much cleaner accents that are easier to understand. So that way, while we're sleeping over here, these Indians can answer the phone or handle customer service problems over the internet just as easily as they could here, and get back to you any time of the day. Okay? So while we're sleeping, they're working. While they're sleeping, we're working. We also have the greater distance availability. For example, working with clients in India or China or Europe or wherever, it's really, really easy to do. We also have much more centralized access to business services. So, for example, human resources. Now, we can put a lot of these resources, like you have a change of address. And I just did this recently. I went to our HR department website, and I could electronically update it for the university. and it gets propagated throughout the university system. I only have to go to one place. I don't have to call anybody. I can do it anytime I want, but since it's centralized, we can do those business services very easily. And it was easy for me to do. And this can lead to a very flattened organizational structure, so that you don't need as many lines of hierarchy. One manager can work with more people because of the availability of information flow greatly increasing his capacity to deal with more people. So you get fewer managers, more efficient organization. You save yourself money that way as well. And then again, you also get a network effect even within the business. Now, the last thing I really want to talk about is one of the major issues when getting onto the internet. Okay, so one of the things that may stop the growth of this value being created, this is phenomenal value. But trust really depends on three major things. Okay, you have to be competent, capable, and have a good character to develop trust. Right? So people are judging, and especially getting on the internet, there's a lot of people out there. How do you know that these people are who they say they are, that they have the systems available, that they're capable of doing what they say they can do, and that they have the moral character? You know, are they honest? Do they have integrity? And on the internet, unfortunately, at times, the anonymizing nature of the internet makes it difficult to measure these things accurately. And there's so many more businesses now that are getting on the internet that how do you know who is who and who you can trust and who you can't? Okay? So lacking the face-to-face interaction that you used to be able to get, trust issues on the internet have grown tremendously. Today, this is probably the main limiting factor for why people either don't get on the internet or don't buy and sell things on the internet. It's because the trust is not there. And so we're going to spend some time, too, talking about how can we overcome this? How can we create websites? And how can we help people understand that we're here to help them, that we are competent, that we are capable, and that we're honest and trustworthy people. Okay? And so reasons why people, even granted, there's this huge amounts of value that can be created from the internet, but if you don't address these issues, it's all for naught. Okay? So that's kind of the last thing I want to leave you with today. That pretty much covers the summation of chapter 1, right? And actually I go a little beyond what the book talks about. But the big thing, okay, the internet is a network of networks that runs using TCP/IP, grown from 4 connected sites in 1969 to billions of connections today. Its success is based upon these 3 big things. Okay, it was designed to be highly flexible, highly reliable, open connectivity with quick standard adoption. Okay, that's actually 4 things, not 3 things. We also found that businesses have to take advantage of the internet by reducing their costs, increasing connectivity, increasing options, and increasing the ability to share information. And by doing this, not only with your customers, but also with your internal networks, you can greatly increase your ability to solve these problems that people have, to make the costs lower, to meet the needs that your customers have, and your employees have, and your suppliers have, and all of your other business partners. And do it very much more efficiently. Okay? But you have to keep in mind that if trust is not developed, forget about it. And it's extremely, extremely important. So with that in mind, we're going to dig into some of these more, deeper internet technologies and really look at more of the nuts and bolts of how this network works and in the next lecture. So stay tuned, and we'll get to that, and then you can be on your way for creating some really rock-solid websites.